Now we're going to turn our attention to why DEI efforts are falling short and what organisations must do differently. We've seen that diversity and inclusion drive innovation, better decision-making, stronger engagement and financial success. The business case is clear. So why aren't organisations seeing these benefits from their diversity and inclusion programs? The reality is that most efforts focus on the wrong level of change. They operate at the surface level through policies, training sessions and representation targets without addressing the cognitive mechanisms that drive inclusion and behaviour change. This is why many DEI strategies fail to produce lasting results. We're now going to explore the four major flaws in traditional DEI initiatives and what the missing link is in driving real change. One of the most common strategies is awareness training. The idea is simple. If we can make people aware of their biases, they'll correct them. But does it actually work? Well, Elizabeth Pallock and Donald Green of Harvard and Yale respectively conducted a meta-analysis on diversity training programs, and they found little evidence that they do lead to long-term behavioural change. They found that while unconscious bias training programs create short-term awareness, they fail to provide practical mechanisms for actually shifting cognitive patterns. And this is because awareness alone is not enough to override deeply ingrained biases. Without structured cognitive development, employees revert to automatic thinking patterns, making decisions based on ingrained habits rather than conscious intention. In other words, knowing you have a bias doesn't automatically mean you'll change your behaviour. Closely related to awareness training, unconscious bias training has become a cornerstone of corporate diversity and inclusion strategies. However, despite its widespread adoption, research suggests that its effectiveness is questionable. In her 2022 article for Harvard Business Review, Lily Zheng identified that many bias training programs have little to no impact on reducing explicit bias in the workplace. And data used for an earlier Harvard Business Review article from 2016 showed that bias training can even have unintended negative effects, creating resistance, reinforcing stereotypes, or leading to moral licensing, where employees feel absolved after attending training and fail to take further action. Like awareness training, unconscious bias training often focuses on identification, but it doesn't provide a framework for restructuring cognitive habits. This means employees return to their default decision-making processes unchanged. If training doesn't lead to action, what will? Well, the answer lies in developing the mental flexibility to override biases in real time and make intentionally inclusive decisions. Aside from training, many organizations focus on improving representation, ensuring diverse talent is recruited and promoted. And while representation is obviously important, it doesn't automatically lead to inclusion or better outcomes. Amy Randall and her team identified that inclusive leadership, where employees feel both a sense of belonging and recognition for their uniqueness, leads to higher engagement, collaboration, and innovation. However, increasing demographic diversity without an inclusive culture can lead to unintended consequences. Employees from underrepresented backgrounds may feel alienated or unsupported, leading to disengagement. Companies that focus solely on hiring for diversity without fostering an environment where all employees feel valued often see lower engagement, higher turnover, and persistent disparities in promotion rates. A study by Alexander Kalev, Erin Kelly, and Frank Dobbin found that diversity initiatives focused on compliance, such as quotas, were often less effective at retaining diverse talent than programs centered on mentorship and leadership development. And researcher Lisa Nishi found that turnover within diverse groups in non-inclusive cultures is higher compared to those in inclusive environments. So what's the takeaway from this? Well, diversity without inclusion is performative. It changes the numbers, but not the experience. And when employees don't feel included, they leave. That's why the focus has got to shift from simply achieving representation to embedding cognitive inclusion, ensuring that diverse perspectives are not just present, but are heard, valued, and integrated into strategic decision-making. At the heart of every failed diversity and inclusion initiative is a leadership challenge. Without leaders who can think in complex, nuanced ways, DEI efforts remain performative rather than transformative. Landon Reed and Rob Folds, in their research, found that individuals with lower cognitive complexity were more likely to engage in rigid binary thinking, making them less capable of navigating diverse and dynamic environments. Whereas Stephen Zaccharo and his team, in their 2015 research for the US Army, identified that leaders with higher cognitive complexity are better at integrating multiple perspectives, managing ambiguity, and making inclusive decisions. In other words, leadership matters, but not just in terms of intent. What separates leaders who drive real inclusion from those who merely talk about it is their cognitive ability to manage complexity.